Welcome to the Red Ink Revival Leadership Podcast. I'm your host, Patrick Norris. We're going to grow your leadership through neuroscience, psychology, and theology. Hi, everybody. Welcome to episode 26 of the Red Ink Revival Leadership Podcast. My name's Patrick Norris, and our goal today is to help you lead with a whole heart, a healthy brain, and a soul on fire. I'm so glad you're with us. In today's show, you're going to hear from Lauren Whatley on conversations about racism. We'll be leveraging Lauren's experience and background in race and gender systems of oppression. Lauren holds a master's in gender and race studies. She has a bachelor's in human development with a concentration in oppression. She teaches women's studies at the University of Alabama. We'll share in Lauren's personal stories of racism, as well as many of the headline topics necessary for our own personal growth. In today's episode of The Influencer, we talk about racism's beginnings and definition. What words are socially desired in identifying the Black community? Generational trauma from slavery and racism. Perspectives on protests, rioting, and looting. I can hardly wait for you to hear the whole thing. But first, I'm so glad to have you with us wherever you get your podcast or in the video version on YouTube. We like to drop new content every week, shooting for each Thursday of the month. If this podcast is adding value to your leadership in life, I'd like to ask you to subscribe to this podcast, like it, and comment in the reviews. Also help us get the word out by sharing it on your social media platforms. If you subscribe and comment at iTunes, it'll make our show pop up in recommended shows. Please help us out with that. Also, I'd like to invite you to a Red Ink Revival Driven People, Driven Leaders free webinar. This hour-long training is with inspiring and fresh insights from neuroscience, psychology, and theology to help you grow in wholeheartedness in every sphere of life. Attendance will open up a unique opportunity to meet in a small group of people with me and a psychologist therapist to go deeper into what drives people. Go to redinkrevival.com today and find out all the details. For all my pastor friends, if you'd like to co-host a Driven People, Driven Leader webinar with me by inviting a group of your pastor colleagues and networks, I'd love to talk to you. All you have to do is get 5 to 10 of your senior pastors rallied to jump on with you, and we'll create a private showing just for you and your tribe. Go to redinkrevival.com/pastors to check it all out. Then contact us with your interest. We'll get back with you as quickly as we can to assess your opportunity, and it's all free. While you're there, sign up for our e-newsletter that'll hit your inbox the first of each month with a powerful blog post, as well as our upcoming events. Go now to sign up. Before we go into today's interview with Lauren Whatley in Conversations About Racism, I want to give you context as to my motivation and intention. As you can imagine, this is going to be an amazing conversation. As a white man, my hope is that we don't look for just a quick fix to racism and then move on. My hope is that we engage relational intimacy with our Black family to feel the human stories and lean into life-changing thoughts and patterns. Many sincere, intelligent, and thoughtful white people are processing the events of racism, protests, and all that's surrounding it. Many of us sincerely declare in private circles, "I'm not a racist." And that may be true, but what if there is more to racism than what we've mapped out? "I'm not a racist" has been the copy for years, yet our Black friends continue to suffer, and it makes me wonder if we really understand. If I really understand. So I want to listen. I want to understand. I want to have a relational connection with Black friends to help me digest ideas. I'm inviting our listeners to experience my exploration through some very difficult conversations. I want to grow, and I'd love for you to consider going on this entire journey with me. No doubt, the further I personally have entered this global conversation of racism as a white man with white emotions and narratives, I notice that sometimes I experience emotional double binds. A double bind's when there are two options and choosing either option means you lose. I've also noticed that this is where many of our white family finds themselves. As an example, if I promote peaceful protests like kneeling to the national anthem, I show empathy and compassion to my black friends. But if I choose that also, I am deeply offending many soldiers and veterans who feel their service to our country is being accosted. I have to wrestle with the emotional loyalty to nationalism and our flag. Another double bind is, if I love and support my police officer friends in any public forum, many in the black community will feel that I'm rejecting their painful past. Another double bind is if I care for the black community's lack of economic opportunity, then does that mean my only option is to promote socialism rather than capitalism? So as you can see, many of our racism conversations run so much deeper than whether we use racial slurs or not. When we talk systematic racism, the conversation gets filled with double binds. For many of us in the white community, there's a deep desire to stand up for our black community and friends. But when we hit a double bind and progress shuts down, we just quit growing and we quit moving forward. So my motivation isn't to make a pithy quick fix. I'm here to learn. I'm here to grow. And Lauren Whatley is a beautiful soul. She's intelligent, she's thoughtful, she's gracious, she is patient to help me see and feel the black community's suffering and innovative strategies. I'm excited for you to hear this Red Ink Revival conversation about racism. Well, welcome to the Red Ink Revival Leadership Podcast. This is going to be an amazing day, an amazing conversation with Lauren Whatley. Lauren is an amazing young lady. She's got a master's degree in gender and race studies from the University of Alabama. She's got a bachelor's in human development with a concentration on oppression. She teaches women's studies at the University of Alabama, and she's passionate about systems of oppression and communicating things that in society are just considered to be somewhat taboo. I just want to say a big welcome to you, Lauren. Thank you for being on today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to talk about this stuff.
Well, I want to say just a little bit about how I know who you are. You attend one of my very close friends, Pastor Brandon Ball, his church, Church Unlimited, and he had a conversation with you that was recorded earlier this year. And I loved your insights. I loved your gift to be able to pull those out and talk about them. And I really enjoyed your heart. And today, as we go into this conversation about race and about where America is and the world at large around racism, I just first want to just honor you. I want you to know that as a white person, I want to listen. I want to be educated. And my hope is for everybody listening, you already know this, that we could have a conversation that's heart to heart and we can explore. I do want to say to everybody who's watching and listening that, you know, I'm just navigating my way through learning. And that means some of my questions may not all come out as clean and good and beautiful as they may need to. And that's not justification or an excuse. It's just I'm aware of my need to continue to grow. I do want to say, please don't assume Lauren agrees with any concept that I bring out or that she is even opposed to them based on my question itself. She's just here really as a friend of Pastor Brandon's. She's really here to help me learn, and I think why not let everybody learn as I learned. So that's the context. Lauren, if you could tell us just a little bit about your backstory and what's motivated you to be an educator in the area of race, gender, and these systems of oppression.
Yeah, so I've actually, ever since I was a little kid, if you asked me what I wanted to be when I grew up about, 4 or 5, I would say I wanted to be a teacher. Then I switched to wanting to be an actor or an actress, whatever, but I always came back to wanting to be a teacher. And when I went to college, I kind of strayed away from teaching for a while. And I was like, maybe I want to go into fashion, or maybe I want to be an event planner. I wasn't necessarily sure the exact way that I wanted to teach. And so I kind of strolled along for a while. I took some classes that I wasn't really interested in, but my freshman year, I took a class called Marriage and Family Studies that I loved. I was so interested in it because we talked about relationships. We talked about the basic psychology of how they work and the like need for connection that humans have. And so I was so interested in that class. I just thought that was the coolest thing. And so when I got to, after a few times of not really being sure what my major should be, I went to the Career Center and she was like, why don't you just throw yourself into that class that you were so interested in? And then going from there, I found that there were a lot of classes that were on racism and sexism, homophobia, transphobia, all of these different systems of oppression that we have in our society. And I was so engrossed in the information. Like I couldn't get enough. Like every assignment that we had, I wanted to do outside reading. I would send my professor stuff like, you've got to see this. You have to see what I found. And my grades went up dramatically. So I was like, this is what I need to do. Fast forward to getting my master's and then getting offered a teaching position there. And so then here we are.
Here we are. I'm so glad we are. You really do have a beautiful gift that I believe God's given you to think through complex issues and to make sense of them. And I know I'll be a lot better, and everyone else will as well for you doing this. Let's begin. Socrates, the philosopher, said you really can't. You can't really have agreement or you can't have understanding until both parties define the terms by which they speak. So let's start with defining how we're going to talk about this group of people. Are we going to call them Black people? Are we going to call them people of color? Are we going to call them African Americans? What do you feel like that the demographic at large, what do you feel like the best thing to use?
Yeah. So these are actually three different things. So the first one, the term people of color, is an umbrella term that includes the other two groups and other groups from there. So people of color basically means anyone who doesn't identify as white. So you might be of Latin descent, you might be indigenous, Black, from East Asian or countries like that. Anyone who wouldn't call themselves a white person is a person of color. Then from there, when we have African American and Black, a lot of people try to say African American trying to be politically correct.
Right.
And they're not actually correct, because African Americans, the technical group of people who would be considered African Americans, are Black people who are descendants of slavery in the United States. But there's also discrepancy because I have my closest friend is Nigerian American, and technically she is African American, right? Yep. Because she is from the continent of Africa. But mostly she would say Nigerian American, but nevertheless, it's still an African American. But the politically correct grouping is people who are descendants of American chattel slavery of Black people. But the best term to use is just Black people, because you're always going to be right when you say that, right? Yeah. I think so many times people think that's an offensive term, and I don't know where that type of ideology came from, because Black people call each other Black. Like when I'm talking to people, I identify as a Black woman. Like I've never thought that was a poor choice of words, but it's always best to say that, because when we're talking about how our society, the whole reason we're talking about this now, because racism discussions are so on the forefront of our news and our minds right now. This isn't just affecting African Americans, it's affecting Jamaican Americans that might be in our country, Haitian Americans, immigrant Black people who are now Americans, right? So it's best to say Black because it's going to encompass the whole group.
Yeah. I laughed so much at you and Pastor Brandon when you did your interview as he was bringing how white people, they get ready to say black and they whisper. They go from a normal
Yes.
conversation to
Yeah.
whispering. And so to say there is a black person over there is actually not offensive. I appreciate you you helping us out to establish that.
Right.
That's
Right.
That's awesome. Well, from there, I'd like to go into your backstory with encounters with racism. What's your earliest memory of encountering a racial experience of racism?
Hmm. The first one that I would say I could point to this and just straight up say this was something racist that happened to me was when I was in the fourth grade and I was on the bus. This was my first time at public school. I started out in a private Christian school and then was homeschooled for a few years while we moved around the city. My dad had gotten a new promotion, so we were moving. And then fourth grade, when we, found the town we were going to live for the rest of, my time of living with my parents, was at public school. And I was on the bus and this boy turned around. I think this was probably one of my first few weeks of school. And he turned to me and he said, "Haha, you have poopy skin." And I was like, and I didn't understand why he was saying that. Like, I'm not very, easily ruffled. My feathers aren't very easily ruffled. People don't really bother me. I've never been bullied. I've had kids try to pick on me, but they don't bother me because like you're just being a nuisance. But when he said that, I was like, why? I don't understand why the color of my skin matters at all. And so then he started chanting it, and other kids were chanting it at me. And then I just got really, really uncomfortable on the bus. And then when I got off the bus, I told my mom about it, and she didn't really say much to me. I think that as a parent, now that I'm older, that's a difficult thing to deal with when it's your child and you see them as so, innocent and perfect, and how the world looks at a child, for especially when they haven't done anything wrong, as less than, right?
Yeah.
And but she went to the school and the boy wasn't allowed to ride the bus anymore. So there were consequences for that. But that would be the first time I would say this was racism.
Oh,
But I've had times of where people were, so as you can see right now, I have braids in my hair, but when I was younger, I used to cry, like, just crocodile tears when my mom would want to braid my hair because the white kids at school would make fun of me for having braids. And they'd ask me why my hair was like that, and they would say that it was weird. And so I never wanted to have braids, which as an adult, I now understand that was still racism. It wasn't necessarily that they're talking about my skin, but it was about the way that my culture presents itself. And so I was probably like maybe 5 or 6 when I was crying because I didn't want to wear braids around anybody and let them see me.
and was that because they were just interested in your hair, or did it project from them that you are less than, that you're weird, that something is not right about you because you have braids?
So one of the things that I've noticed about when people say or do things that are racist, where there's so many different types of ways that racism presents itself. We've got the people that are like blatantly, there's no way you there's no way you can deny that this is racism, because they truly despise, dislike, have a problem with people that are less than them. But then there are other types of times that racism presents itself in which people are just replicating things that they've heard from other people, and they don't actually know the root of what they're doing or what they're saying. Whereas So there's a very, very long history of Black women not being able to wear their hairstyles or being persecuted for their hair, going all the way back to the 1700s when there were starting to be more Black women who were free, and they were wearing their hair how they wanted to wear it. They had, time to actually do their hair, and white women were saying that it was causing their husbands to cheat. And so there were laws put in place, especially in the antebellum South, that Black women had to cover their hair. And so it's been something that's been a part of our culture for a very long time, that Black women and the way that we do our hair is weird, or should be covered, or it's unsightly, or it's unprofessional, and I mean, I've had so many instances going through school and with other people my age of them saying things about my hair and treating it like it's weird or something like that. Yeah. And I think that at the age of 6, those kids don't actually know what they're saying, but it's just a replication of this system of treating, hair on Black women, Black boys, Black men as something to be othered by.
Yeah, yeah. And we know that there are children teenagers that went to their prom with dreadlocks, and they were sent home. So there is clear connections with various racism moments.
Right.
I think about your story, even the poop skin story, and as a child trying to process that. That's one whole emotional spin of just unrest and anger and so on. But then as a parent, I feel it. I've got 2 20-something-year-old boys, and if I had a 4th grader who came home with something like that, I would be upset, and I'm understating it. My emotion would be much more progressed than that.
Right.
So when you think about this, obviously every Black person that I've ever known they have these stories. Everyone, and some of them more brutal than others. And as a parent, as a family, how do Black families teach their kids about potential racist experiences that'll be coming?
I think that it depends on the family a lot, because there's not like a general across the board way of dealing with things. It's kind of like when your parents have like the sex talk with you, and like it's awkward and they don't necessarily know what to say, but they know they should say it. And then some kind of give you that book and they just go away, or some people are very open about it and some don't say anything at all, right? It just kind of varies depending on the family. And that is what I've noticed being being a Black person and talking with other Black friends, is that some people in their families, their parents sit them down and say, because of the way that you look, you're going to be treated differently. And sometimes it's bullying. Sometimes kids your age are just mean, but sometimes it's because of the way that people that look like you are treated in our country. And these are some of the ways that you have to, that you have to go into situations, because you have to remember that they're already counting you out, and you can't give them another reason to just completely cast you to the side. My parents didn't really talk to me about it, but in terms of, here's racism, this is what's going to happen. But I know that one thing that my dad was very, very adamant about was the way that I talk. He didn't do slang. He didn't allow me to say like ain't, and I'm from Birmingham, Alabama, so it was really hard not to say ain't. But he wanted me to make sure that I always spoke in a very standard English type of way, because he didn't want anybody to see me as unintelligent or not give me opportunities because of the way that I speak.
Yeah.
So even though he wasn't talking to me about racism, it was still experiences that he's had with racism that guided the way that he raised me.
Well, I can honestly say I'd never had any of those conversations with my kids. And
Mm-hmm.
as a dad, it breaks my heart to think that, black dads, black moms, they have to navigate those waters and consider them normal. This is
Yeah.
what normal black moms and dads do. And I've never worried a minute about the things as a parent that black moms and dads have to think about. And I just have a tremendous sense of empathy and the feelings of compassion that are around that. One of the things that you have said is that your personal experiences, your personal private experiences with racism, they're not the only times that you've experienced racism. That every time another black person tells their racism story, it feels like that it's happened to you again. Can you talk about that a little bit more?
Yeah. So the simple way of explaining it is just that when someone experiences racism, I know that if I was in that place, it would have been me. It's just simple as that.
Yeah.
Like, because a lot of the times that people have experienced these things, like when I was on the bus, I was just sitting on the bus. I wasn't talking to that kid before he turned around, and I was new. So I wasn't really talking to anybody. I had like one friend on the bus who lived across the street from me. So it's not like I put myself in this position where someone, maybe I bothered this kid, so now he's going to retaliate, right? I'm just sitting there. And so if I were to hear about someone who maybe they went into a store and the store owner is following them around because they think they're going to steal. Well, if I walked into that store, it would be the same thing because, I've never stolen a thing in my life, but the store owner doesn't know that. They just see me as a black woman walking into their store. They have a negative opinion of black people, whether it's conscious or subconscious, right? So like some of these prejudices that people have are being passed down from their families, right? Like when you're a little kid and you notice that your parents don't like or don't interact with certain things, you don't like or interact with those things as well, because little kids pick those things up from their parents, whether there's an actual articulated, we don't do this or that kind of conversation, or they're just reading your body language, because kids when they're younger are like a sponge, and then no one teaches you to undo those things, right? And so if I was to be in place of that other black person, then I know that that would be me. But it's also just an empathy for other black people, because even if that wouldn't have been me, I know what it feels like to just want to do something simple like go to the grocery store or ride the bus or do your hair, or be driving and the police officer pulls you over, and hoping that it doesn't escalate into something, and knowing you have no control over that situation. You're just normal you, but someone doesn't see you as the way that you see yourself or the way that other people see you. They see you automatically as a threat or as kind of like a blemish to society.
I have never, ever gone into a store and been concerned that somebody was following me around. And if I did, as a white man, I'd turn around and be like, "What's up, man? How you doing?" That's
Yeah.
a white man's world.
Mm-hmm.
When I think that every single black person that I'm friends with, if we've ever had a racism conversation, every single one of them have told me that they've had the experience of being watched closely as though they're about to steal something. And again, that's not something that I have experienced. It's not something that I've had to ever have a conversation with my boys about. That's just amazing to me. Well, let's move from that into some of these stories. So as an example, there are stories that are real close in history to where we're living right now. In fact, one of the things that you told in the previous interview with Pastor Brandon is that today, as an example, there are still 500 chapters of KKK.
Mm-hmm.
Still, right now.
Yeah.
That's just mind-boggling to me. That
Mm-hmm.
that there's not more education, there's not more progression, and just that stat, if I am a black person, that stat causes me to have a threat awareness. I can't go anywhere without thinking, is this doctor, is this police officer, who this person I'm interacting with that may have power in my life that I don't know is actually a covert KKK racist.
Oh, yeah.
I never have that thought. That blows me away. So then we move from that to, and I want you to tell this story of your friend Denarian and how he was applying for jobs. First of all, tell a little bit about his qualifications and then move into what he did and the difference.
Okay, yeah. So I have someone that I went to college with as a friend of mine. He's in the same fraternity as my brother. And he was applying for jobs. He had been working in his field for a few years and wanted to find a new opportunity, making more money. And so he put his application into or his resume, into Indeed or Monster.com, one of those job sites. And so he, applied for quite a few jobs, probably about 40 or so jobs. And he was getting hardly any calls back, maybe 1 or 2, 3 calls back. But as someone who had been in the field as long as he had applying for these jobs, he was surprised that he wasn't getting as many calls back. And so he decided that he was going to change his first name on his resume. So he changed it from Denarian to Denny. So it's not like forgery, like he, made up a fake name or anything. Like it's just his nickname. But the difference between Denarian and Denny is that when you hear Denarian, you're automatically going to think of a black man.
Yeah.
Versus Denny, you're either going to think of a white man or you're not really thinking about race at all. You're like that come into your mind. And so he put the same resume in. The only thing he changed on the whole resume was his first name. And he got a call back from almost every single place that he put his resume into.
Unbelievable.
And so, and that's part of the reason that my parents named me Lauren, is that they didn't want you to think of my race as soon as you heard my name. And it's a very sad thing that has also gotten me into a lot of doors. And then when I get to the interview, they're like, oh, this is not what we expected you to look like. Because they're like, my voice and my name didn't match the fact that I was a black woman. And, it's a really sad thing that something as simple as your name, which you don't decide for yourself, right, can keep you out of places just because they assume before you even get there, your race.
Yeah. That's just so wild. And again, this is heart experiences. This is emotional moments in the life of black people that white people never have to think about. We never have to think about that. Another one has to do with the loans. I have heard statistics, and I'm not one that has done the research to find out what all that was about or how they came to the conclusions they did. Yet, if I'm a black person and I hear these statistics and I hear these stories, it impacts me. It does have, in the area of therapy, when professional therapists are working with clients, there's something where you have trauma that is a big T trauma, and then you have little t trauma, all those like paper cuts, where if you have a paper cut, but you have them in multiple times over and over and over and over, it will be the impact that you took a big old knife and cut yourself deep within the skin. And these are traumatic moments, just to know this. But in these loans kind of examples, there have been research done that white people and black people went to banks to apply for a loan and had the exact same credit rating, or the black person even had a greater credit rating, had a greater resume portfolio to be able to get the loan. And then in exact banks, exact cities, they showed that the white people would get the loan, the black people would be declined.
Yeah.
Are you familiar with those studies, and what is the impact that has on you?
Yeah, so I'm not a numbers person. I will admit to that. These are studies that I've read, but it's like I can comprehend numbers and they help me contextualize things, but numbers do not stay in my head. For me to be able to just say, oh yeah, these were the figures on that. But I know that is something, and then tied with that is that in our country today, a black person with a bachelor's or a master's degree will more times than not make less money than a white person with a high school diploma, just because of opportunities and not being allowed into these certain institutions.
Yet, and this is part of neuroscience, that when the brain doesn't have an answer to why something is happening, it's going to search for meaning. It's going to look for what's the meaning of this. A white person will often have their brain scan into other areas of, I wonder if I didn't get it because, maybe I don't look professional enough. Maybe I'm overweight. Maybe I was not articulate. I overspoke. That would be that. But one thing a white person never has to do is think about, is the reason I didn't get that job because I'm black. And that is a very real emotional thing that sometimes I think as white people, we tend to minimize and say, well, I don't necessarily think that is the reason they didn't get it. And it may not be the reason they didn't get the job, but at the same time, because of all that goes into the greater context, your brain is being impacted as though that is the reason, and white people need to care about that. We need to care. One of the things that we talk these stories that just blew me away was when you guys were talking about interracial marriage in Alabama. And go ahead. I'm going to let you just talk that all the way to the surface. What's that interracial issue about in Alabama?
Yes. So interracial marriage became legal in Alabama in the year 2000.
Well,
so it's only been legal for the last 20 years. I am older than that law. And
that's mind-boggling to me.
Right. And at the same time that they did that, they also changed the law that a judge does not have to issue a marriage license to a couple anymore. So they now, if you go into a courthouse to ask the judge to marry you, they can deny you. Now, it doesn't happen as much as it did back then. I would say it happens more with same-sex marriages that they'll deny than it would with an interracial marriage. But they changed the law at the same time. And this is one of those clear times that you can see that racism transforms over time. It's like, okay, we're going to fix this, but then we're going to change this that allows racism to still be perpetuated. So yes, it's legal, but it's also legal that we don't even have to abide by that law in the first place.
Well, I'm 55 years old, 55. And if you'd have told me that happened in 1950, I'd be like, nah, that needed to happen. It was, for sure, it was beyond its time. And yes, when I say that, obviously any time is, necessary. Mm-hmm. That's just elevating or putting a spotlight on 2000, the year 2000.
And 40% voted against.
So wait. So the legislators, the lawmakers, 40% did not want to vote for there to be a legal right for interracial marriages.
Correct.
And
So it passed
how in
60%.
the world did they keep their spots? How in the world did they? That's just it's wild. That's wild.
Yeah.
We move from that to things that go back into history, segregation. That's not that long ago. Rights to vote, not that long ago. Slavery.
We're talking about my grandparents getting the right to vote in their lifetime, and I had three of my grandparents died from cancer, so they died early. But my grandma is still alive, and she still drives. Matter of fact, she's got a new business sewing masks for people, so she's not senile at all, and she got the right to vote in her lifetime, and she technically would have been old enough to vote if she was allowed to. If she was allowed to vote at 18, she went years before she was able to vote.
Hi everybody, my name is Patrick Norris, and I'd like to introduce you to our Red Ink Revival Leadership Platform, where we offer resources and experiential discovery to help you lead with a whole heart, a healthy brain, and a soul on fire. We believe driven people ought to know what they're driven by. Odds are you're already a high achiever and a visionary. But what are you driven by? What are your teammates driven by? What is your organization driven by? If you've ever struggled to figure you out, to know what winds you up or shuts you down, if you've ever been mystified by teammates who are stuck in old patterns of thinking, control, codependence, risk-averse, grandiosity, and more, or if you have strived to change the culture of your organization, but somehow the opposing current has just been too strong, now more than ever, understanding the drivers behind your life really matters. Your leadership journey to wholeheartedness begins with our flagship free webinar, Driven People, Driven Leaders. This hour-long training is with inspiring and fresh insights from neuroscience, psychology, and theology to help you grow in wholeheartedness in every sphere of life. Go to redinkrevival.com today and find out more. For all my pastor friends, how would you like to co-host a Driven People, Driven Leaders webinar with me? If you want to invest in other pastor friends, inviting a group of your colleagues and networks, we'd love to set that up with you. All you have to do is get 5 to 10 or more senior pastors rallied to jump on with you, and we'll create a private showing just for your tribe. And it's free. Go to redinkrevival.com/pastors to check it all out. While you're there, sign up for our e-newsletter that'll hit your inbox the first of each month with a powerful blog post, and then subscribe to our weekly podcast at redinkrevival.com. And then you think about slavery and how recent slavery is in the history of humanity. That's not that far back. And so that leads me into talking about trauma. Legitimate PTSD trauma as it's related to racism. How do you think about trauma and racism, how that it's injured the brain's attachment circuitry, and based in this is brain talk, but based in the amygdala's emotional energy pockets that it builds from grievous, offensive experiences, all the way to the hippocampus's ability to create context and say, be watching out for anything like this. If anything close to this begins to happen, get into a heightened threat position because you do not want to die here. Trauma is a very real thing, and it can't be rationalized away. It's a part of the emotional brain. And when we think of trauma, there is something called epigenetics that we know today, and science goes to the 3rd and 4th generation. It's an inherited thing. Now, epigenetics doesn't mean that the trauma is automatically going to be turned on in the gene, but it does predispose, just like if you have alcoholism in your family history, that those genes, for many, will be turned on, and if they're not, they can quickly get turned on. And so when we think of so much that's happened in the Black community, it's easy for a white person to try to address the Black community and the decisions that need to be made, trying to transfer onto the Black community they're trauma less, having no trauma in race, and telling them how they ought to function and how they ought to act. Can you talk a
Right.
little bit about what you think about when you think about trauma as it's related to Black people?
Yeah. So when you first say trauma, going back to my grandma, I tried to ask her one time about about what it was like when during Jim Crow, when segregation was legal, and all she could really say was, well, that's just how my life was. And i and i tried to ask her more things, and she just couldn't even vocalize it. And I think that part of that is because that really was how it was. And so, when that's all sometimes it doesn't, you can't recognize that you don't have to experience that, or you don't have to live a life with those things. But also because of the trauma of it. Like, we're talking about someone who grew up knowing people who had crosses burned in their yards, and who were lynched, and who couldn't go into certain stores or have certain jobs, who couldn't vote. We've already discussed that. And it's like a constant reminder everywhere you go, everything you do, that you are less than for your skin tone, which is completely out of your control because of the way that our country, what we call the United States today, was set up, of having slavery, and that being something that we've had for so long. And then going straight from that into Black codes, into segregation and Jim Crow. And then when we got rid of it, we did nothing else. We just stopped having it. And then they didn't do anything to try to teach people about how to be better, or how to properly integrate, groups of people together, or help a group of people, Black people that have been disenfranchised for so long. And when you're talking about trauma, I think that it can present itself in so many different ways, because when we're talking about trauma that you've experienced, like if you've dealt with violence, maybe someone who, with a hate crime, maybe that someone has died, or been attacked, or, like I said, my parents have friends who've had cross burned in their yard, and that put a lot of fear into them too. And there's also trauma of like little small things, right? Of like me, like I said, going back to the braids thing, of how I didn't want to wear them for so long because of the trauma of dealing with being bullied for years and years and years, that I didn't wear braids again from when I was a little kid until I turned 20, because I did not want to deal with it. And it took all the way till that age to realize that that I didn't have to put up with that, or how to handle myself in those situations. And then a third leg of trauma, and how this is not just how you experience it or how you feel or things that you avoid, but also because of your health. Because when you're dealing with stress and trauma, your cortisol levels are up through the roof. And people have the highest levels of cortisol production in the United States. And cortisol, when you have high levels of cortisol, can affect a plethora of other health concerns.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
It can affect your weight and being able to gain or lose weight. For women that are pregnant, it can cause, trouble with the gestational process. So when you're dealing with the trauma and cortisol and this constant fight or flight reflex that you have, it's not as simple as just saying, hey, we're going to just start treating Black people nicer, or Black people need to get over these things. This is so deep that it's truly affecting our health.
Yeah.
And it's affecting our life expectancy because of how much we're constantly thinking about our own survival.
Yeah.
Is it Maslow's hierarchy of needs?
Yeah.
That's the triangle. And safety is like one of the basic principles of the hierarchy of needs. It's like with food and shelter, and then you have all these other levels that go above that. And how can you effectively have your other levels, self-actualization, right? Or finding purpose, all of these other things that are on this hierarchy of needs, when your basic level of needs of simply having safety are not being met.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, in brain science, particularly when we look at child therapy, so children who've had abuse and traumatic experiences, and then they go into school environments or they are in a foster care home. Often what the teacher or the primary caretaker will assume is that I just can teach them into transformation or teach them into emotional regulation. Well, the brain doesn't function that way. And what we kind of do in child therapy areas is there is a three-layered brain that we talk about. You've got the brain stem, and it is all about survival. You've got the limbic brain, which is all about connection, belongings, feelings of being seen, soothed, known, celebrated. And then finally, you have the cognitive area of the brain, which is trying to make sense of things, and that's where learning happens. Well, because the lower brain, the basement of it is the primal brain itself, that the brain will function in a survival state, and it cannot have an intensity in the cognitive brain to learn until the survival brain and the belonging brain is safe and sensing connection. Well, this is an area that when white people around racist kind of conversations, when they would say, as an example, well, you guys just need to get over it. Well, that's like telling somebody who's been raped that they need to get over that and just enjoy a healthy, functional relationship with no sexual dysfunction. Well, this is brain, this is science. This isn't this nebulous kind of hanging stuff out in mystical worlds. This is the way our brains have been designed by God to actually work through things. So when we talk about trauma that way, I think it's interesting how if an animal, a dog, were to be attacked by a predator and they were to fight that off, the traumatic experience of that in an animal would cause that dog then to go over to the side after the occasion, the event, and they will shake to disembody the trauma. It comes off of them in that way. Well, as human beings, whenever a person has experienced trauma, often we have never been taught how to disembody it. So we carry it in our bodies. We carry it in our brains. And when you have like a child, back into child play scenarios, when you have a child that's had traumatic experience, physical abuse, sexual abuse, and so on, they will do some of the most erratic and very harsh and violent behaviors in the classroom. And the teacher can't teach them out of that. The teacher's going to have to get into their world with them and to talk with them. This is every race. This is humans. This is the way humans function. And so when I look, and I want your feedback on this, and I'm listening today, I'm hearing. So, as I look at people who move from protesting right now into rioting and looting, or like the man who had a pawn shop, I believe the man who had the pawn shop, black man, he lost everything that he had here in the last week. And then I hear of a black retired police officer that gets killed trying to protect a place. And when I think of all of that, I think white people have a tendency to look at that and they just, kind of have this, it's they kind of will look at it with a disgust.
Yeah.
And if we understand trauma in the brain, it fits in the profile of somebody that's been traumatized throughout generations. Generational trauma is now then showing up. So when you hear me say that, I'm a white guy. I know that a lot of times it doesn't feel good to have somebody who's never experienced what you experience to give this whole definition of things. But would you say that's accurate? And is it okay for a white guy to say that?
So I think that there are a couple of things here when it comes to the riots and the protests right now and trauma. So the first thing, when we're looking at the looting that's happening with the protests right now.
Yeah.
So the first looting started with a Target in Minneapolis, and we saw that the Target, was completely looted and it burned. Right.
You're talking Target store. Yes.
Yes. Target Superstore. And so that Target was actually looted for a particular protest reason, because when they had the initial protests in Minneapolis, and the police came and they started tear gassing the protesters who were peaceful.
Yeah.
And so then they tried to go to Target, which was the closest store, to buy or to get, items that would help with the tear gas. So usually people try to use milk to like as an eye wash, is like to try to combat the burning, or like to get water. They tried to get, clothes, backpacks, things like that. And Target would not they wouldn't let them in, and they wouldn't let them purchase the items. And
I didn't know that.
Yeah. And the Target also supports financially the police department there. And so the protesters looted Target because Target was denying them the products and the supplies and support they needed for their constitutional right to protest. So then the Target also burns down, right? Then from there, so that was a looting that was part of a stance taken against the protest and a retaliation to that. I think that from there, the way that looting and these riots have gone from there have been, I don't want to completely categorize them as this, but I've been watching a lot of the videos of them. I've been protesting as well. Nothing happened in the ones that I was in. We were just at the park and, speaking our minds with signs, and then we all went home. But at a lot of these protests, I think the way that the looting is happening right now is we have opportunists that are now using this distraction of what's happening now, of the police are all at the protests. The police are, they're forming these lines, they're here, and they're seeing looting as part of the protest and using that as an opportunity to loot. Because usually looting is not, especially with Black Lives Matter, looting has not been a part of protests that we've seen in Black Lives Matter protests from here on out. It happened in Ferguson with a gas station that they looted and burned down because of a very similar reason to Target, of denying people supplies that they were trying to purchase for the protest. But it's not something that we see that happens all the time with people in these protests. What I've seen more often when we're talking about violence with these protests is the way that the police are responding to the protesters that are out there. I've seen more tear gas being used on people that are walking down the street or being taken off their bike. I saw a DoorDash employee pulled off of his bike and arrested because he was out during curfew, but he had identification that he was allowed to work after curfew. I've seen so much that's happened of trying to control the people that are protesting instead of answering what they're protesting about. And if we want to talk about stopping riots, stopping looting, then just address the problem of why people are protesting in the first place. And if we're not out there protesting, then there's not going to be any more looting, right? Like, and another part, something else going to the riots, protests. Oh, yes. The third thing that I wanted to say about how these protests right now are far more aggressive than they have been for the same issue. But I think that something that's really important to see right now is that we've actually had more change with these protests for police brutality than we've ever had for any protest about police brutality. Because people always say, why can't you do things peacefully? Well, Colin Kaepernick tried to be really peaceful about this same issue 4 years ago about police brutality. And everyone was so concerned with the tactics that he was using that we didn't really get any of the change that he was trying to advocate for. And I think that when people focus so much on the tactics instead of what the issue is of the protest, you're never going to get any change. You're just distracting from what the actual problem is and the change, because most people would admit that they don't want the police brutalizing people, right? Like, because it's not just Black people, it's all people of color, it's white people too, right? It's not just Black people, even though Black people are the most likely to be victims of these situations. Yeah. And so if we continue to address these, the tactics of the protest instead of the issue, we're never going to get anywhere.
Yeah.
And like I said, Colin Kaepernick was totally peaceful and he was blacklisted. Martin Luther King, who people always like, Martin Luther King would abhor this. I was like, Martin Luther King said in his own words that riots are the language of the unheard. And so he even recognized himself that while that might not have been the tactic that he used, could comprehend that you can only handle so much before it's too much. Yeah. And then you get to this point where now it's like, we cannot take it anymore. Not to mention that I think the fact that we're in a pandemic has added an extra level of this, because we have 40 million people unemployed right now, right? And we got almost no help from the government whatsoever. I know I didn't get any help from it because I was in my master's program last year. And so I technically didn't qualify for any type of stimulus, even though I could have really used the help, right? Yeah. So you have a lot of people that are all of these things are happening at one time, in which people are just fed up at this point. Like they need something to change. Something has to change. We can't continue on this way anymore. And so to say, I think that trauma definitely has a big part to play in it, because people are, like I said, they're fed up. They've experienced this same thing over and over again. This type of denial of simple safety in a country that they live in, of a society that they belong to, that you get to this part where it becomes too much.
Yeah. When I hear, I want to come back to Kaepernick, but I really would like to do that later, because I kind of want to contextualize as we move through pieces. But when we talk about this area of Target that was looted because they wouldn't sell people who were looking for something that they needed because of the tear gas, I hear first of all, I feel emotional conflict internally, because I want to lean in with all the empathy that I have, and I don't want to be I want to be a student. I want my ears open. I am confident that I've talked more and listened less than what I should have. So that's where I
Mhm.
want to be. But when I have these emotional things that I'm just like, man, what do I do with that? Where do I put that? And I hear the white narrative. I hear the white narrative in my head
Mhm.
of conversations that I've heard white people say. And that is so because Target, in an endeavoring to align with the police, would not sell, products to people who were being tear gassed. In your mind and in black people's mind in general, is that still a justification for that? Or maybe it's not a justification. I just want to understand. I heard like Dennis Rodman, he was condemning, I don't know that he condemned the Target, but he was condemning the looting.
Mhm.
Um, and, I'm not saying Dennis Rodman is anybody's spokesperson. He may be, may
Right.
not be. I'm just saying, as a white person, in the way that I have grown up, I've thought, that still doesn't make it right that there's
Mhm.
looting going on. Help me hear your heart as you hear mine.
Um, it's hard to say. My personal opinion of it is to neither condemn nor condone. I
Okay.
just understand the reasoning, right?
Yep.
So I wouldn't say that if I was out protesting that I would be looting a store or something like that, but I do understand the reasoning behind it, even if that might not have been my own strategy behind it. And I would say, you know, as a person, white or not, who might not condone what's going on. They think that that shouldn't be the way that we do things. Fair enough. I can concede that. I totally can. I think, especially if we're looking at a lens of criminality and morality, you could say that that's wrong. Okay, but then what? It's
Yeah.
already been done, right? Like now we have to go forward from here.
Yeah.
And if we're I think not in terms of our conversation here,
Yeah.
but in terms of progress, we're wasting time.
Right.
If you can't hear out the pain of a whole race of people because of looting, which by and large is not happening in every protest,
Yeah.
nor every
Right.
state, or even every city in every state. And so if we're going to take that happened, in a few of these places, which, like I said, I wouldn't be a part of that.
Yeah.
But if we're going to take that and say that this is the most important part, well, the only way that you're going to stop that is to address the reason that the people are protesting, which brings us back to the same thing over and over again.
Yeah.
And going back to what I said before, like I said, we've had more progress now than we had before. So if you're telling protesters, if you're telling people who support Black Lives Matter, this isn't the way you shouldn't do things like this. Well, tell me why are we getting success? Like, why are we getting the a rural officer who had his knee on George Floyd's neck? These protests have raised his charges from um, third degree to second degree murder, I believe. I think it goes from third to second to first, if I'm in terms of severity.
Mhm.
So they raised those from third to second. They've also charged the other three officers who were there. They've reopened Breonna Taylor's case, which they had originally considered closed. We've also had a new law in the city that Breonna Taylor was in about police knocking on doors. We've also had different cities talking about how they fund the police and putting more money into community projects. So we're getting a lot of response.
Yeah.
And while I would say that I'm not a violent person, I've never been in a fight in my life. I've never even hit my own brother. I'm not a violent person, but I can understand from a totally, I don't think I could ever be objective on my own survival, right? So this is also a protest for my personal survival. So I don't think that I could ever truly be biased, and I won't pretend to be. But in looking at this protest and then going to Colin Kaepernick and then looking at Martin Luther King Jr. and how, while there was still violence in those protests, because we've seen the fire hoses, we've seen the dogs, we've seen, people going to jail, we've seen people being murdered, but they were taking a passive stance, right? Like, we're getting answers, and even though that might not be what people want to say is the best way to get those answers, the faster we get those answers, the quicker these protests die out and we don't have to do them anymore. But the longer that we focus on tactics and why you shouldn't do this or why you shouldn't do that, or this isn't right because this or that, it's like, okay, but I mean, we're already here. And the protests are going to continue the way that they are in those cities that decide to do their protests that way, right? Because, like I said, most of the cities are not, even though that might be the way that it looks on, on TV or what you're hearing from other people. But most of these protests are not going the way of looting. And so if we focus on the small, we're going to really miss an opportunity to fix something that should have been fixed a long time ago.
Yeah, yeah. When I asked that question, when I asked the question as I did, as a white person, and you and I just having a conversation, does it feel like to you, or would it to a typical black person, like I have just diverted what is the real issue to talk about the justice of Target and what is legally, morally right? Does it feel that way to you and to black people as generally as a whole?
Yeah. So I wouldn't say as much in this because I know that this is more of an educational moment, but when I'm talking to peers and they bring that up to me, I'm like, okay, so on my side of things, I'm talking about people who are dying and people who will die. And you're talking about merchandise in a city that you don't live in. And it's like, why are we talking about that? And it seems very counterproductive to treat the cough instead of the cold. Like, why are we talking about looting? Like, okay, let's say, like I said, we'll condone. I mean, I'll concede that might not be the best way to do things. But now can we get back to the real issue here? Yeah. Like, and another thing is when I'm talking to other black people, we don't talk about the looting at all. I only talk about it with white people who want to talk to me and understand it and try to get me to explain that it's wrong or want me to admit that I think it's wrong. But the people that are actually protesting or the people that have a personal stake in what's going on, we're talking about that. We're talking about what can we do next to try to get voices to be heard. And I do understand that because I always try to look at things from, not just why are you asking me that, but really I want to understand, why you're asking that. And when you haven't had to ask for the same basic human right for decades and decades and decades, and then I think so many more people are paying attention now than they ever have before. But, it seems like it seems extreme now because you just started listening now. But how many different ways can we ask for the same thing? We're going to just keep trying everything we can. We've tried the peaceful protests. We've tried the kneeling. We've tried putting people in in political positions in office. We've tried writing laws. We've tried lobbying. We've tried education in schools. So now we've got to try something else. And this is where we are. And it was always going to get here if it didn't get answered by any of those other ways before. It was eventually going to come about this way.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I love the way that you are articulating what you see, what you feel, how you experience. You already know, because I've told you 100 times just in the pre-interview, of just how much I love your spirit and your heart. I do think that these are the areas of the conversation that where there's a lot of struggle, because I think white brains want there to be a cognitive. Whites have these emotional conflicts around what we just talked about with justice, and is it right to loot and all that, and it's a genuine emotion, and I don't think white people can metabolize we shouldn't feel that. And yet when I hear your heart and I hear you talk about the emotional connection to the deeper root system, you are pulling me into you. And I'm not really just talking about me. I'm not I'm here to learn, but I just feel like that the white community doesn't make as much progress as I think that we could or should. And I'm trying to, on a brain level, figure out why. Why is it that these conversations tend to be polarizing? And I do think that there is a tendency for me not to see the emotional drivers, because we're all driven by emotion. Everybody says, I'm not driven by emotion. I'm driven by, well, the very emotion that I'm not driven by emotion is what's driving you saying you're not driven by emotion. And I'm saying that to every one of us. And so I just think it's important that we first of all pull ourselves into the empathy of what somebody else is experiencing, the way you're experiencing it. And for you to offer that is truly a gift. And I appreciate you letting me see how you have, kind of made sense of the target, the looting, and even the fact that you and your friends don't sit around, black friends. You guys have never talked about looting. That's interesting, because I don't know you well at all, but I know you to be a person of morality, a person of character. I know you're excellent as a human being. And so, there's a lot of merit that has to go into that. And so anyway, I don't know that what I just said, well, I guess it would be helpful when you hear me say what I just said. How do you experience it?
Experience which part?
The part where sometimes it feels like that we have these cognitive apex beliefs and ideas, and then we try to say to each other, you shouldn't feel that. And, to a white person, you need to get over this idea of looting's the issue, when there's emotions below the surface that are there. And that me hearing your heart is what opens me up. Because honestly, with you, Lauren, I feel safe. I feel like that you're going to hold me in sacred space. I feel like this conversation can do something to me. So that's what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Experience.
I think I'm very against telling people what they shouldn't feel. I think that that's really counterproductive to anything. If what's happening with the looting and stuff, if that's really what bothers you, it's okay to feel that. But I think that we need to contextualize that we technically want the same thing.
Come on.
and helping people to realize that if you're just going to condemn the protest, you won't get what you want and I won't get what I want. And so if we can realize that what we both want is, we technically both want violence to stop.
Yeah.
You want it, not you, this is a generalized you, but you want the looting violence to stop, and I want the police violence to stop, but they have to stop together.
Yes.
One is not going to stop without the other. They are two sides of the same coin. And so when we realize, I think this is a big part of protests and all that in general, is most of the time people want the same things, but it has to be put into it has to be framed in the way that you can see that it's really actually the same thing that we're asking for, because people that aren't inclined to criminal activities are not looking to go out on a crime spree, right? Yeah. And I've seen so many people that are protesting and they see people that are being opportunists and taking advantage of the looting, and they're like, stop, we are not for this, we are not doing this. People that have been spray painting and stuff like that, like, I mean, actually taking, cans of paint out of their hands, saying, this is not what we're about. We are trying to make our voices be heard and leave no mark other than the resounding sound of our voices. And so if we want the same thing, we've got to realize that they're the same thing. And that's the big part of this.
And it's beautifully addressed and spoken. Again, I feel your heart. I do want to say that I can speak for me. I wouldn't want to speak for all the white population, but I can speak for me, that there is no comparison in my mind of the emotion I feel about the police violence that we witnessed with George Floyd. There's no comparison. That with looting doesn't even fit in the same universe. Right. And yet, as a white person, with all the constructs that have gone into me, when I think of the protest and then I think of looting, there has been, let me say it that way, there has been a stick point, and I love that you're allowing me to process through that. Mm-hmm. And I don't want to be unhealthy, and I don't want to see the world in one dimension. So you've privileged me, and I do want to give a lot of heart and thought around all of that. And a lot of times we emote things that have nothing to do with what's right or wrong. Sometimes we emote things because that's the way we always saw it and we always believed it. Right. So yeah, I want to admit that. So, well, Lauren, we've got to number 6 out of, I think, 29 questions.
It's a good conversation. I think some of these things we might have even touched on, of just the organic way that we were talking about them.
Thank you for joining us. You might be wondering what's next. Consider jumping in on one of our free webinars called Driven People, Driven Leaders. These hour-long trainings are with inspiring and fresh insights from neuroscience, psychology, and theology to help you grow in wholeheartedness in every sphere of life. Attendance will open up a unique opportunity to meet in a small group of people with me and a psychologist or therapist to go deeper into what drives people. Go to RiotingRevival.com today and find out the details. For all my pastor friends, how would you like to co-host a Driven People, Driven Leaders webinar with me? If you want to invest in other pastor friends, inviting a group of your colleagues and networks, we'd love to set that up with you. All you have to do is get 5 to 10 or more senior pastors rallied to jump on with you, and we'll create a private showing just for your tribe. It's free. Go to RiotingRevival.com/pastors to check it all out. And while you're there, sign up for our e-newsletter that'll hit your inbox the first of each month with a powerful blog post, and subscribe to our weekly podcast, RiotingRevival.com. Everything we're building is to resource you to be a wholehearted leader. I'd love for you to be a part of our tribe. I can't wait till our next episode, and I'm glad that you were with us today. We'll see you next time.